Catholic history classroom, and we have many documents and teaching materials related to American Catholics in labor. Because we house the papers of John A. Ryan, we house the papers of Monsignor George Higgins as well. We house the papers of Terence Powderly and other labor leaders. We've made resources available on the web through our website, so you can access those also. So I would start with a little anecdote that was recounted by labor historian Eric Goldman. He tells a story on the usefulness of Rerum Novarum to Father John A. Ryan, who of course is the great articulator of social teaching in the early 20th century. Ryan was, of course, a contemporary of other individuals interested in labor, Protestant and Jewish individuals interested in labor as well. And after Ryan had been hurling Rerum Novarum, this is Goldman's words, these are Goldman's words, at his enemies for years, a reform-minded rabbi achieved a masterpiece of superfluity by saying to the priest, quote, "You have a very great advantage over men in my position. You can hang your radical utterances on a papal encyclical." "Yes, I suppose there is something to that," said Father Ryan, smiling, unquote. So Ryan, like the two others I'm going to touch on here, affiliated with Catholic University, made the most of this encyclical in his attempts to promote Catholic social justice. He received his Ph.D. here in sacred theology in 1906, and then taught in the School of Sacred Theology various subjects from 1915 until 1940. And he was pretty much electrified by Rerum Novarum when he first read it in 1894, and according to Social Doctrine and Action, Jerry, in fact, he says that he never read it in the seminary, and he read it, 3 years after it was issued, which appalls him. But its ideas were not new to him. He had been reading and listening sympathetically to the proposals for the state regulation, and E.J. Dion mentioned this a little bit too, of industry made by the populists and by the Farmers Alliance for a decade before reading Leo's encyclical. And he believed that the state was responsible for regulation of industry even before he read the papal encyclical. But it became for him, importantly, as it would for many other Catholics in subsequent decades, a Catholic mandate for state action on behalf of labor. As he put it, I'll use his words, quote, "The doctrine of state intervention, which I had come to accept and which was now sometimes denounced as socialistic in those benighted days, I now read in a papal encyclical. Only those who know the condition of American Catholic social thought before 1890 can understand how and why Leo's teaching on the state seemed almost revolutionary," unquote. So the encyclical, coupled with his influences related to his Irish-American upbringing and Midwestern populist roots, would inspire his substantial and influential advocacy of a range of programs and legislative measures aimed at improving the conditions of labor. And as E.J. Dion mentioned, a legal minimum wage, he was an advocate of that, an 8-hour workday, protective legislation for women and children. And he wrote, of course, many books, scores of books and pamphlets that drew from Catholic social teaching generally to justify the state's role in ensuring such measures. And most famously, his dissertation, A Living Wage, published in 1906, carefully considers this question. And it's one of the first works in English on this particular question. He endorsed labor unions, it should be emphasized, but he believed strongly that the ultimate responsibility for rectifying problems of the new industrial society lay with government. And in 1919, he would write, again, as has been mentioned, the Bishop's Program for Social Reconstruction, which was endorsed by the National Catholic War Council, which is the forerunner of the Bishops' Conference, and it's based on the principles of Rerum Novarum. And it advocates, again, regulation of child labor, establishment of a minimum wage, a national health care system, among other things. Now, I should say here, then, that Ryan was very much a scholar, very much so. But he was not satisfied exclusively with abstract argument, and he worked hard to turn his agenda items into concrete legislation. And he did it from here, and that's one of the reasons he liked he wanted to be here. He also assisted in the drafting of minimum wage legislation in Minnesota, and advocated an amendment regulating child labor unsuccessfully. When the legislation for the National Labor Relations Act was before Congress in the mid-1930s, Ryan, as the first director of the Catholic Bishops' Social Action Department, joined others in urging its adoption. He later said that the National Labor Relations Act was probably the most just, beneficent, and far-reaching piece of legislation ever enacted in the United States, his words. So, and as was pointed out, many of his proposals in the Bishop's program made their way into New Deal legislation. And he's been referred to as the father of minimum wage, and you mentioned Charles Coughlin. He was referred to by Coughlin sarcastically as the Right Reverend New Dealer, a moniker that actually people that admired him took up proudly, the Right Reverend New Dealer. So Charles Coughlin used that word in a negative way, but it was sort of like used to support him. So unlike many of his contemporaries, Ryan believed that Catholics should be active in influencing public policy toward improving the rights of labor, and he exercised leadership in his post on campus here. He also was the head of the Social Action Department of the Bishops' Conference, which was run, well, his office was in Caldwell, and he did a lot of his quarters were in Caldwell, and he did a lot of his work from there. And as the head of the Social Action Department, along with Raymond McGowan, they heavily emphasized work on behalf of workers. Labor schools, etc., was part of the whole social action agenda early on. And their task was promoting the social thought of the church and interpreting, under the guidance of the bishops, the application of the teachings to key social questions of the world. So it operated as both a service department for lay organizations and as a central clearinghouse for disseminating Catholic thought in the field of social action to the Catholic press, to schools, to the religious, and to the laity. And so they disseminated this information all over the U.S. Through the Social Action Department, and it heavily emphasized industrial problems of the time period. So he headed that from its inception in 1920 up to 1945. So he had tremendous influence on several individuals here at CUA. And I'll just mention Francis Haas, because we don't have that much time to deal with this, and George Higgins. There are two examples that'll take us up to the end of the 20th century in a kind of genealogy here. Now Higgins, perhaps the most influential clerical Catholic labor leader in the latter half of the 20th century, was heavily influenced by Francis Haas. Though Higgins was deeply appreciative of Ryan, in fact, he realized there were other individuals that had a substantial impact on labor here in a federal sense and locally. And Haas was one of them. He wrote in the 1990s in his memoirs, Ryan was not the only New Deal reverend in Washington. Francis Haas was a Milwaukee-born priest who was a master of the art of labor arbitration, big and shaggy-haired. They called him Red Haas. And some business folks called him this for reasons other than his hair color. And Haas, right here on campus, would deliver talks after Sunday Mass to students that were interested on labor issues of the day. And perform this important but informal educative function here. He came from Wisconsin in 1919 to study sociology and economics. This is where he met John Ryan. And under Ryan's influence, he becomes the champion of unionization and a living wage. He more heavily emphasized unionization than Ryan did. He finished his doctoral work here in 1922 and published a dissertation on collective bargaining in the men's garment industry. And after a stint in Wisconsin, he returned to CUA to head the National Catholic School of Social Work. So he exercises influence in that sense too. And his timing was quite auspicious. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was inaugurated in 1933, and his administration was looking for talent, and Haas had it in spades. He was recruited to serve on the Labor Advisory Board of the National Recovery Administration from 1933 to 35. He served on the National Labor Board from 1933 to 1934, hugely consequential appointment and a significant time period. By this point, he'd been instrumental, Haas, in mediating or arbitrating more than 125 industrial disputes. The Northwestern Chronicle, a Catholic weekly, called him the ace of federal peacemakers, in fact. And the Works Progress Administration's, he was appointed to the Works Progress Administration's Labor Policies Board and served there from 35 to 39. So he's one of the most successful labor mediators of the period, and he was assigned as the chief federal conciliator to the famous Minneapolis trucker strike of 1934, which he helped resolve successfully. And any of you that know labor history are familiar with the significance of that particular strike. And I should note, we have the papers of Francis Haas up in our archive in Aquinas Hall for anyone that's interested in examining those too. So he emphasizes a strong labor movement, unionization, where Ryan is more interested in legislation. His talent for mediation earns him the post of Special Commissioner of Conciliation for the Department of Labor, and in 1943 he was appointed the first chair of the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Now, unfortunately for the FEPC, he was named the bishop of the Diocese of Grand Rapids only 4 months after getting that post, so he didn't serve in that position very long. However, there was another student of both Haas and Ryan here at the university who remained in town and would be of great consequence to the labor movement in the later half of the 20th century, so he picks up the mantle here. And that's Monsignor George Higgins, who just died in 2002, a CUA graduate who helped sustain the momentum of labor organization during the complex changes of the late 20th century, the movement into post-industrial society. He had lectured here after getting his degree. He's involved in this. He's also the head of the Social Action Department of the Bishops' Conference, and he lectures in the School of Social Science and in the Department of Theology. He came to study for his Ph.D. in economics in 1940 and finagled his way into staying here for the rest of his life, actually. And he lived over in Curley Hall from 1980 on. But he arrived, nonetheless, well tutored in Catholic social justice issues, as he had studied under the progressive thinker, Father Reynold Hillenbrand at Mundelein Seminary. According to Higgins, Hillenbrand, quote, ushered in an ecclesiastical New Deal at Mundelein, unquote, and helped him and the other seminarians realize that, quote, social action was not an extracurricular activity. This is Hillenbrand's work, unquote. So by the time Higgins arrives in D.C. in 1940, John Ryan is retired. He's a little over 70. Higgins is in awe of him, but he doesn't have a whole lot of contact with him. So he arrives tutored by Hillenbrand, well-read, a strong family interested in labor issues, but he spends more time around Haas, and he's listening to Haas's lectures at the time here on campus. He runs the Social Action Department from 1954 to 1967, and he works with the Bishops' Conference on a range of labor issues. He also authored The Yardstick, which is the weekly commentary on economics, labor, and social problems from 1945 to 2000. And of course, as many of us know, he's the moving force in the church's support for Cesar Chavez and his union movement of farm workers when those workers are struggling against the grape growers in the Coachella Valley in California. He was assigned the task of advising the bishops who were appointed to mediate the dispute by the Bishops' Conference, and he manages to get the growers and the workers to the bargaining table. And this, this culminates, of course, in the California Agricultural Labor Relations Adjustment Act in June of 1975, which guarantees farm workers the right to determine by secret ballot, if any, which union, if any, they want to represent them. So Higgins has also been a voice, and this was mentioned earlier too, for unionization within Catholic institutions. His memoirs go on extensively about how important it is for Catholic institutions who have been advocating unionization for non-Catholic institutions to allow unionization within their own institutions, namely hospitals and schools. And Higgins was not afraid to talk about that, as those of you who knew him know well. So he emphasized that as well. And of course, his efforts get him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2000. And I'll just conclude here with a little quote on Higgins from Coleman McCarthy, who wrote in 1993, quote, "There is scarcely a labor union in the United States, from steel workers to mine workers to farm workers, that hasn't had its rights to fair wages, health and safety, and collective bargaining defended or advocated by Higgins," unquote. So it's effloresced into this late 20th century influence here. You know, a lot of this took place right here on campus at the university. Thank you.
As Steve mentioned, my interest is largely in Irish American history, so as is often the wont of Irish Americans in a Catholic audience, if this seems too Irish and totally Irish and not very Catholic, I apologize, and please call me up short on it. Let me begin with Al Smith. In 1927, American Protestants realized that Al Smith was going to be the likely candidate for the Democrats in the 1928 election. And an Episcopalian lawyer named Charles Marshall took it upon himself to write a long letter explaining why a Catholic should not be elected president. Marshall's letter was filled with references, very learned references to encyclicals and papal documents. When Al Smith saw the letter, he is reputed to have said, "What the hell's an encyclical?" and then to have turned to his aide, Jacob Proskauer, and said, "Can you write a response to this?" To which Proskauer smartly said, "That would be perfect. A Protestant criticizes a Catholic about politics, and he asks a German Jewish judge to respond to it." Now, I say this not to demean Al Smith, who was probably or may have been the best governor in New York history. And although he became conservative in his older years, his later years, while he was in the New York State Assembly in the 1910s, was the very embodiment of Rerum Novarum, implementing the recommendations of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Commission. Nor to demean Rerum Novarum, but to ask, what difference do these encyclicals make? What impact do they have? Certainly there were other people who were interested in these encyclicals, in the Rerum and its successor, Quadragesimo Anno. Franklin Roosevelt, as Jerry pointed out, made an important point of citing Quadragesimo Anno in support of his own economic program in 1932. Roosevelt, who had once been Al Smith's friend and later became his enemy. Even more, John Brophy and Phil Murray, who led the CIO in the 1940s, swore by the Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. It became a very important support for their vision of how the American economy should be organized. Polish-American workers in the late 1930s flocked to their parish at St. Monica's when the priests at St. Monica's began to read out the encyclicals Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno and began to expound upon them. But I'm not sure that the encyclicals inspired the action, that the encyclicals inspired this kind of interest, necessarily initial interest and motive for social and economic reform. FDR, after all, was looking for the Catholic vote. He probably knew no more about encyclicals than Al Smith did. Brophy and Murray had a much deeper interest, a stronger interest, but their interest in industrial councils, a kind of corporatism, actually began with their work in as United Mine Worker leaders in the minefields of the United States, Pennsylvania, Indiana, elsewhere in the early 1920s. That was the inspiration. And those Polish workers had already begun to join the UAW, to organize, one of the great chapters in American labor history, to organize the UAW when their parish priests began to realize that Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno might have some relevance to their experience. In saying this, I do not mean to say that the encyclicals are not important. They are very important. But what I think they do is to legitimize, or did, is to legitimize the aspirations, the motivations that people had already. They added moral weight to a critique of the American capitalism, to efforts to organize our workers or to find a middle way between socialism and unbridled American capitalism, free market capitalism. But this raises some questions about where did those motives actually come from? Why were American workers and politicians moved to engage with Catholic social justice, engage with social justice issues in general? And did Catholicism have any role, Catholicism broadly conceived, not just as church papal teachings, but broadly conceived as a kind of, as a religious lived experience, did that have any impact on those people in motivating workers and politicians and voters to support those kinds of economic and social justice programs? Labor historians would have said no. Maybe Herbert Gutman would have said maybe, but most other labor historians would have said no, that motivation came from their class interests generally, and that really, in some ways, most labor historians probably would have said that Catholicism restricted or hindered or limited what American Catholic workers were doing, that they would have been more committed if there hadn't been Catholicism. I think that severely underestimates the breadth, the depth, length, and richness of the American Catholic social justice tradition, the American Catholic fight for labor rights and for economic rights in America, which dates at least back to the 1830s, 1835, when, I apologize, Irish coal shovelers go on strike and set off a general strike in Philadelphia, setting off again a rage for working men's parties up and down the East Coast, Boston, Philadelphia, New York. It comes forward into the 1880s when Catholics begin to dominate what is the first real important national union. Jerry referred to the Knights of Labor. Catholics not only dominate the leadership, they're overrepresented in the leadership and among the followers in the Knights of Labor. I think this Catholic tradition achieves its political expression fully in the 1910s, in the Democratic Party revival of the 1910s, when the Democratic Party takes over state houses and also wins the presidency. And in those state houses and state legislatures and in the Wilson administration, Catholic Democrats begin to forge their own version of progressivism. It reaches its fruition in the 1930s. Perhaps most of the people who joined, the men and women who joined the CIO in the 1930s were Catholics, largely second-generation Italian, Polish, Lithuanian, and other Catholics. At least, certainly, above the Mason-Dixon line, that was true. And Catholic voters and Catholic politicians were strong supporters of economic justice programs in the New Deal and in the Fair Deal as well. In the 1953, Paul Blanchard, who was no friend of Catholics, in fact, was a leading kind of anti-Catholic publicist, acknowledged that Catholic voters and politicians were generally progressive and to the left of center, actually, in their approach to economic programs in the United States. And it reaches its conclusion, or reaches, not its conclusion, but it reaches a high point again in the second New Deal with the passing of Medicare and other kinds of social and economic legislation. So there is this long kind of tradition, but again the question is, what is Catholic in the motivation here? And this is more difficult because labor historians, and there aren't many left these days, but labor historians did not pay much attention to religion and the religious effect on working class culture. And Catholic historians have not paid much attention to it either. There's a sense from a lot of historians, my colleague Leslie Tentler among them and others, that there is something to Catholic communalism, a kind of Catholic communalism that informed the kind of working class culture of Catholic workers and led to their support for not only labor unions, but also for economic and social justice programs. But that still has not been teased out. That's an agenda for the future, a scholarly agenda, but agenda for all of us. But it is important anyway, this is my point, is to put these, not treat these economic pastorals or encyclicals separately, but to see them as part of a broader tradition of Catholic social justice, a broad Catholic social justice tradition that includes the lived religion of American Catholic workers and others through the last 160 years. Thank you very much.
Wow, what a rich feast. Once again, I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience, see if we can get a conversation going. There's a microphone in the middle, and if anyone has some questions, please stand up and take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, my name's Li Yang. And again, I think this session is very good and also very timely. This situation, we think about Republican or Democrat, whether they are fighting for the people. And a lot of time, is whether from local to federal, the legislation is really misleading. First, by the title, and second is by the way they process. You may be the first in original bill. It seems easy and simple and it's right, but after the first reading and later maybe especially judicial conference, and that is totally wrong. So I just wonder if you have examined this type of legislation, whether it's local to federal, and maybe they abuse, maybe the private partnership, or they abuse affordable housing, or they abuse all the civil rights, and maybe they say they firefighters, for teachers. Actually, it's not actually. They are really taking away their rights and their taxpayers' money to benefit a few. So this kind of trend is very awful, and it's really take away the people's money to benefit a few. And when I say a few, I don't mean just a corporation. I mean there are some bad people, and they even infiltrate to the civic organization, including non-profit organization. That's why they have this legislation, bad legislation, easy to pass, and good legislation is hard to pass. Once they pass, will not be able to implement correctly. So I just wonder if you have this kind of examination that really hurt our society.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I could speak to the current situation, or I would. There certainly was for example, on Knights of Labor, there certainly was a tradition, not only a Catholic tradition, but an American Republican tradition of seeing the rich as not just rich, but also conceiving them as aristocrats who were antagonistic, or the antithesis of the American Republican tradition, and that required good people who were committed to the American Republican, American Republicanism, to curb their power, to reduce their strength. That kind of aristocracy didn't belong in America, and that it should be its power and sway should be limited. I don't know if that addresses some of your issues.
I may add just one thing. I think EJ this morning mentioned that there seemed to be a decline in the Catholic approach after the encyclical, after the pastoral letter of 1986. And with some fear and trepidation, is Ralph Rohner here by any chance? No. Yeah, we went to high school together. But anyway, he was present for a dinner that I was invited to with Patrick Ellis. And one of the other people there argued that the bishop should not speak out on the economy. And I said, well, it's sort of embarrassing when I look back and find the Jesuit president of Georgetown defending slavery. And the man said, well, I can defend slavery because it's in Scripture. You would know the man's name, so I won't mention it. But I mean, I think what's happened is that we were too successful in our educational system. We catapulted a whole generation from working class and urban dwellers to middle class and suburban dwellers, where the church plays a different role. 1/3 of American Catholics have left the church since 1965. There's not the same influence anymore. And therefore, even in social thought, it makes it all the more difficult, or social legislation.
Thanks to all of you. It was a very engaging presentation. Mention was made of George Higgins' yardstick. And thanks to George Higgins' yardstick in our diocesan paper, I learned a great deal about the Catholic social teaching, and then had the good fortune of studying in the seminary and learning even more. A question, are those articles published in any book form at this time? Are all of them readily available?
I don't think they're they've been published that I know of. We have copies of them, all of them, but I'm not sure that they're.
Is there any movement to publish those?
I don't know of any offhand.
Okay.
There has been a study. John, do you want to? A recent study of George Higgins and the Yardstick, I think, by you want to stand up?
Also, there's a site, I'm not sure what it's called. I think it's just called the Catholic Labor Network, something like that. It's a website that has many of the texts of the yardsticks published online. And that's all I have to say on that.
If I could add something to that, it seems to me that we have extraordinary resources available to us in this room in a number of venues, and this strikes me as a project that very much deserves some additional funding. So, those of you who are interested in funding the publication of this, it seems to me there's a good opportunity to get together and do so.
I think I would welcome the opportunity. I'd certainly contribute to it. The other question is, I remember Monsignor Higgins proposing unionization within Catholic institutions. What I cannot remember, were there any bishops supporting that position?
I'm sure you know this book.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, use the mic.
I'm sure you know his memoirs. He has a whole chapter where he discusses that, and he had a hard time finding bishops to support unionization within Catholic institutions. In fact, he talks about Roger Mahoney being so important in the farm workers movement. When it came to unionization in California, within Catholic institutions, Mahoney was not as, open-minded. It's his memoirs. It's Organized Labor in the Church, Reflections of a Labor Priest. Great book.
My name is...
It's on, John.
Yeah. Father Foley, anyway, he's John Krumkowski. I was interested in one of the dimensions of Tim's presentation and Father Foley's presentation, and that's the tension between the experience and the text. And I think you complement each other in some interesting ways, because if in fact the text of Rerum Novarum was related to the experience of the American worker and to the tension that not having a text means to the church, or condemning, for example, activities in the American church, if that condemnation leads to the sort of rebellion that the McGlynn situation produces, and that in fact the organization of the labor movement in the United States is full of Catholics, and then the text comes later, then it seems to me that while I'm fully supportive of trying to resurrect my good friend, let him rest in peace, Monsignor Higgins at his text that we've got the thing wrong. It's not the text that is important. It's the experience of a Catholic tradition that brings forth certain claims about fairness and about justice and about power, and the use of that within the American context, that is the arena within which the Catholic tradition really lives, and that we've become derailed in our focus on texts as sources of guidance. That is, sometimes texts as the contention over the 86 document produced, sometimes texts become a way of having persons who are really interested in political change and action are able to produce divisiveness in a population that is as vital to the American experience as the Catholic population is. And that divisiveness, in fact, has made the Catholic vote in the United States fundamentally irrelevant because it's divided in a way that, in fact, makes it a 50-50 thing. So there's really no way to get to where I'm concluding, but I think it is worth thinking about how important the experience of the Catholic lived tradition is while we have a conference on a text and we focus on it, because the tension is palpable that the tradition is really much more important than the text. And if, in fact, we had Catholic pronouncements that reflected the Catholic tradition, we might be back toward recovering or renewing or discovering again in our own time what were the origins of this deep desire to speak to the modern world in a way that would resonate with the Catholic notion of personal dignity and the Catholic tradition and all of its richness.
Well, I think I agree in many ways. I mean, that's in some ways what I was suggesting, John, I think, too. And Jerry's point about that the Knights of Labor and the Henry George campaign lead to Rerum Novarum suggests that it's the experience, to be, again, invoke Irish people here, but in the Henry George election, Irish immigrants voted for the Tammany candidate named Abram Hewitt. But second-generation Irish Americans who were heavily skilled workers and unionized voted very heavily for George. And so there was the possibility of losing those people in that way. So they were forcing people's hands, as they were in the Knights of Labor, which was so heavily Catholic, Irish-German Catholic in particular. But I agree with you that there's some way understanding. What I would suggest is that what American Catholics need, one of the things that our American Catholics need to do is to recover or to research, understand what that tradition has meant. Sometimes it hasn't always been good, this kind of communalism. Sometimes it was Harold Meyerson in the first session raised Jim Fisher's book about the waterfront, the Irish waterfront, where you had a very corrupt union which did badly towards workers, but communalism protected that. The kind of very closed-mouthed kind of communalism of the waterfront protected that corruption and let it fester. You can also have cases where communal solidarity, Catholic communal solidarity has led to racial racism or racial exclusivism or exclusion of non-whites from their neighborhoods, etc. So it's a complicated and ambiguous or ambivalent kind of tradition in some ways, but it's a powerful one and a rich one. Also, as you suggested, I think, and the way in which it fuses with how Irish and Italians and Polish Americans were the American working class. As David Montgomery, I was reading recently, and preparing for this, David Montgomery, the famous labor historian at Yale, said immigrants did not join the American working class, immigrants and their children. They were the American working class. And so they brought those kinds of traditions from overseas, but they made new traditions here. It's a lived experience. It evolves over time, and it includes I think it includes this kind of communalism. I also think it includes a kind of populism, a kind of anti-elitism that makes them skeptical about the rich and their privileges. wary of those. There's all sorts of things that go into it. But one of the problems that we have, I think, as scholars and also more broadly as Catholics in the way that scholars have not served American Catholics well, is not to recover that tradition and its kind of richness and the way it intersected with kind of working class life and produced both a commitment to labor and a commitment to social and economic reform. But I wouldn't say that the texts are necessarily problematic here. I, for one, am very happy that Pope Leo XIII issued Rerum Novarum, and its kind of strong commitment to critique of free market capitalism and also its support for working people to organize. I think that was important, and that's why, although Ryan was an agrarian radical, John Ryan was an agrarian radical before he came here. If you read his seminary diary, it's really kind of interesting. He's just apoplectic in 1892, and somehow as if he didn't expect that the populists don't win the presidential election. He's just apoplectic. He talks about Wall Street and all this other kind of stuff. He's also, I should say, again, my bow to my Irish roots here. He was also very moved by Patrick Ford in the Irish World, who was also a radical Irish nationalist, and the Land League. So all those things kind of combine. But once he discovered, as Maria said, once he discovered Rerum Novarum, the light went off. This allows me, this legitimizes me, this legitimizes my quest, gives it power and a kind of weight that I might have trouble with. And as you suggest, if it doesn't happen, then what happens to American workers or to people, American Catholics who are eager for a kind of social and economic justice? I mean, if that isn't issued and isn't issued at that particular moment, what would happen to them? So, I mean, there's a kind of relationship there. There's a kind of broader tradition, and there's a textual tradition within it, and there's a kind of relationship, and I think we need to study more what that broader tradition is and then the relationship to the textual tradition.
Could I just add one other thing? You mentioned the free market economy. We had a speaker come to Charlottesville a couple of years ago, and he claimed that Centesimus Anus supported the free market economy 100%. Now, he knew he could get away with it because he knew Catholics wouldn't read an encyclical. I mean, it was nothing could be further from the truth. Another point, you mentioned the Irish Land League. The Irish Land League picked up the thought of Henry George, and initially people like Cardinal Manning supported Henry George, and then all of a sudden it got too complicated. But that was one of the issues, because some of the controversies surrounding Henry George had to do with the land strike, or the rent strike of the Irish Land League. So it all got intertwined. By the way, Edward McGlynn, Father McGlynn, was also involved with the Irish Land League.
Hi, Clayton Seignai from the Catholic Labor Network, which was mentioned a few minutes ago, and our website, if you're looking for it, is www.catholiclabor.org, which has a lot of these documents on it. My question...
Is Yardstick on your site?
Pardon?
Do you have copies of Yardstick on your...
I believe so. I'm not the webmaster, but... My question is, there have been a lot of business leaders over time who have prided themselves on establishing amicable relations with organized labor. Are there any prominent Catholic business leaders in history, through the history of this document, that you can think of who said, Rerum Novarum, that's why I want to reach out and establish good relations with organized labor, or with my workers, or pay a living wage, these kinds of things?
I'm trying to, there's a couple that come to mind, but I don't have enough background on them. One is, and I'm trying to remember we have the papers of one of them, but I can't remember his name. I don't know, John, if you can remember.
Aaron Abel has him in his book.
Who established a cooperative varnish company in, I think in Tennessee, Callahan, and was a friend of John Ryan's. I also think, I haven't done a lot of work in this, but I also think, is it Bannigan, the rubber manufacturer in Rhode Island, was another good example of somebody who put that in the 1890s and early 1900s, who also put that into. There are probably lots of other examples, but those are the ones that come to mind.
My name is Rudy Oswald, and I've found this a very interesting presentation. but I found that it did not bring very much of this into the present. If you talk about labor leaders who were Catholic, they didn't stop with Clarence Powderly. We did have George Meany. We did have Tom Donahue. We have John Sweeney here today. We have Rich Trumka. We have dozens of International Union presidents who are Catholic. And if our only teaching of the history of the relationship of Catholics and social teaching ends with Murray or with Powderly, I think we have missed what we're trying to do in terms of bringing history into the current understanding of the church and American labor leaders.
We're going to be putting up a new website that covers 100 years of Catholics in labor, and we've got several lay leaders, for example. You are emphasizing the lay leaders specifically that we cover on that site too, so we're thinking a lot about that. Thank you, but that's a great point.
If I could make a comment in regards to this as well, it seems to me that the gentleman's question, though, does raise the question about the current relationship between Catholicism in America and the American labor movement, and I think that's very tricky ground, to explore in a panel like this. But perhaps the next panel will be able to address it a little bit.
Anything? I'm Pat Malloy. Again, I'm an adjunct at the law school here, but I really enjoyed this panel. What I was struck with was when I was growing up, I went to Catholic high school, Catholic college, Catholic graduate school, and what you guys are talking about and the rights of labor, and I remember John the 23rd, Mater Magistri, profit sharing. These were all things that the church was in the middle of. And I got that in my education. But I'm wondering, was it Roe v. Wade? And then the fact that Ronald Reagan and the Republicans became pro-life, and they weren't part of this Catholic social teaching. And then the church became so pro-life that it de-emphasized all of this sort of thing. I mean, is that part of what's happened here in the church? And because I don't hear this being pushed by the church at this point in our history.
You know, you mentioned Mater Magistra. Remember, this was the first time that the laity dissented from an encyclical. Mater si, Magistra no. And you know who came up with that phrase? It was given to him, Gary Wills. Gary Wills gave it to Buckley. Yeah, he admitted that in his autobiography of a former conservative. And that was the first time that there was this challenge, but I agree with you that this is one of the issues. I'm not going to get involved in it, but one of the problems I have with some local priests where I live, they said we must support Jerry Falwell because he's against abortion. I said he's against abortion and against Catholics because he prohibited me from just giving a classroom lecture at Liberty University. Because if I were allowed to do it, his school would close because the anti-Catholicism was so prevalent. And he did distribute anti-Catholic literature at all the registrations of new students. So it's very hard to cooperate, but when people became single issue, they didn't realize they were undermining all the Catholic social teaching. I'm against abortion, by the way.
Just a couple quick follow-ups. Again, I would recommend the Catholic Labor Network site, which, and I've looked at it just last week about the documents it has. It is all the social encyclicals and the yardstick columns. It has a complete set of the Higgins yardstick columns from maybe the last 10 years of his life, so roughly from 1990 to 2000. Those are all online. It would be nice if the previous ones would be more available as well, but at least the most recent 10 years roughly of what he did is available. And I also liked the John Court, whose papers are also at CUA, and who was a convert to Catholicism and a layman who helped found the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, the ACTU, spoke very nicely about this issue of influence of doctrine first versus doctrine first or beliefs first that the encyclicals influence. And he said that, I mean, like, he came to the ideas of being pro-labor essentially before being aware of the encyclicals, but yet they really, like, but they really were helpful as a guide and to show that, yes, he's on the right track. And for people who aren't, and for people who, like, for working class people who have lots of pressures, like the employers against unions, to have a labor priest say, yes, the church is on your side, is very helpful and supportive. And I'd recommend Court's memoir, which is just published the past 10 years, Dreadful Conversions, that discusses that and a lot about the Catholics and labor. The question I had was, like, when we were talking about how a lot of labor historians tend to diminish or say the church was not a helpful factor in the labor movement, one of the reasons they gave was arguing that the communists played a big role in the labor movement and its success in the U.S., and Catholics were very anti-communist. So I'd be interested in the panel's opinion on how important were Catholics to the weakening of communism and the labor movement, and how important that was to hurting the labor movement in general in the United States.
Well, that's a $64,000 question, I think. Remember, Rerum Novarum has another side to it, and one is a condemnation of socialism and also a affirmation of private property. And it was used by Catholic labor leaders as far back as Father Dietz in the American Federation of Labor to fight against socialists in the American Federation of Labor. The question of how important it is, that's a very difficult kind of question. And Phil Murray, who, as my estimation, seems to be a great man in lots of ways. But he would be remembered for lots of people in terms of the purge of the communists from the unions in the 1940s, late 1940s, and what effect that had on unions. Now that is open to debate. Was it a powerful effect? Some labor historians, particularly of the left, would argue that that had a very powerful effect on the labor unions and they weren't quite the same ever after. Others would say no, that was a necessary act to perform and was important, and labor was even more powerful afterwards. But it is, a kind of important question. I think one of the issues here is to remember that those Catholic labor leaders who were anti-communist were also pro-labor. They were in support of labor rights. As you mentioned, Court, Murray, others were very much in support of labor rights. They didn't believe that communism was the way the labor movement should go. So, but it's an issue debated among historians about what effect that battle had on a labor movement and what role the Catholics played in.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Carroll, I'm the Executive Director of the Franciscan Action Network. I'm also point out I'm a former public employee union president. I served as president of a state employee union in Connecticut for many years. My question is, I was here about a month ago on a conference that the Institute put on immigration. It was a wonderful conference. And there was a lot of discussion about how the early church, American Catholic Church, was formed by immigrants. And I think some of you spoke earlier about how Rerum Novarum sort of got its genesis from the immigrants who came to America. They were the working poor. They came to America, and it kind of influenced that. And so can we use Rerum Novarum today? And I'll ask you this, if we can use it today on the whole immigration discussion that's going on now, because part of the conference last month, they talked about how the American Catholic Church is going to change because of all of the immigrants that are coming in, who are predominantly Catholic. Can we use this doctrine to help the immigration debate today and discussion today?
Could I say, I just want to say one thing there, and this pertains to the whole question of doctrine. George Higgins specifically talks very eloquently about how Rerum Novarum, when it was first issued, wasn't seen as a historical document. and how it needs to be interpreted later in the 20th century historically, as do the other encyclicals and the other teachings. And he says we're not doing enough of that, and that we need to think about exactly what you're talking about, and to think today historically about what it meant at that time and what it means today. And I think your question gets right to that.
I'd also like to make a point. It's not just immigrants, but it's also children of immigrants who are kind of critical here. And I think it was as much the children of immigrants, Catholic immigrants, who made the labor movement first in the 1880s, 1890s, and then again in the CIO in the 1930s and 1940s, and that were really critical players in that. And the second generation is a kind of interesting, potentially fragile, vulnerable generation for this generation of Latino immigrants, for example, and others, but was then as well. And so it's very important, those traditions being able to be made relevant to those kids of immigrants who, as well as to immigrants who are coming north from Latin America.
Someone mentioned where the labor movement was north of the Mason-Dixon line. I'd like to defend my Mobile in New Orleans, and also talk about if there is any connection with a couple of things that were going on. First of all, I think this is a lot of what my father used to tell me in growing up. Cardinal Gibbons had relatives in New Orleans. There's a Gibbons, I think, feed company or whatever. Then you had a situation where the Jesuits in New Orleans were very interested in social issues. In fact, my father graduated from Loyola, and Huey Long actually spoke at his graduation. So there was a connection there. And then I think even further on, Father Toomey and what is still going on. There is a publication that comes out of Loyola in New Orleans by the Jesuits on social issues. So is there any connection? Was there any influence that Cardinal Gibbons, who I think went to New Orleans maybe growing up, and actually when he was a cardinal, was there any impact of what was going on there in New Orleans, out of New Orleans mainly, and also even bringing it up to the civil rights movement we had, where Archbishop Rumble actually excommunicated 2 or 3 people who were fighting integration, et cetera. There's always been within New Orleans, I think it's a center, and the Jesuits play a big role in that, an interest in social issues, and Cardinal Gibbons' connection there, I don't know if it's ever been explored.
He did spend part of his boyhood there. I don't think there was any direct influence on that, but you do have, by the teens of the 20th century, the Jesuits opening labor schools all over the place. And of course you have the blueprint for the South coming out of Loyola of New Orleans, and then also Spring Hill. But then I'd like to pick up something else that political tradition carries on by Lindy Boggs to a great extent, I would say. It's carried on to a great extent by Lindy Boggs and her family in terms of seeing the integration between social justice.
And also what you mentioned earlier about Fairhope, Alabama, which was an influence of the person who came from New York. All of this kind of came together in Mobile and in New York.
We have a professor, he's retired now in the history department at UVA, Paul Gaston, and he's a native of Fairhope. Mm-hmm. So as soon as he heard that I was lecturing my class 30 years ago on Henry George, he came. So.
At one point, I didn't mean to slight south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it occurred to me that one of the strongest supporters in the Episcopal hierarchy of labor, CIO, was Archbishop Lucy of San Antonio, originally of Los Angeles. And Texas is below the Mason-Dixon line.
Let me jump in with another thing. In the 1928 Al Smith election, Al Smith took the Deep South. It was states like the Commonwealth of Virginia, first in hatred of Catholics, first in capital punishment. In terms of it was, for instance, the Democratic turnout remained the same from 1924, but the Republican turnout was doubled. The same thing happened in 1960, by the way. And you can look at the voting pattern of the Deep South in 1928 and 1960, it's almost identical. But there's no historical study done on those states. It's curious because there's books done on the Al Smith campaign, but not on the South. There was a different tradition is what I'm arguing.
We have time for one more question.
My name's Linda De Leon. We just moved here from the state of Texas and glad to be here. My question would be, I've learned many names like Monsignor Higgins, but who has taken those roles now in promoting social justice? My husband is a retired police officer and I'm work for the phone company, so we're union and labor movement. We're probably the only two here, and I'm a Latina, so I grew up with my dad being an immigrant from Mexico, and discrimination and everything else, but when you have your own, and I'm a devout Catholic, but I vote Democrat because of social issues. I don't base my politics on just one item, and I'm against abortions. But the point here is, where does our Catholic faith fail when we have a priest, and my daughter changed Catholic parishes here because we had a priest in Alexandria State after the November election that if you voted Republican, don't come up to communion until you go to confession first. And so she changed parishes, and we now belong to that one. You know, so we have an issue and a problem within our own faith community when we have these type of things occur. And what I'd like to know is who's taking that role? I was also an elected official for 24 years, a public servant, and I fought justice. I actually sued school board members, my fellow school board members in federal court, and won because of the social injustices that were occurring. Had opponents that every time I ran for re-election, the establishment ran someone against me, and because of my public views to my community that I represent, single member districts, I always won by 65% or better. So that's my question is, where does our Catholic faith fail in still continuing to fight this issue, and who are the heroes now?
It's Jerry.
I gave an address to the bishops in their annual meeting in November of 2001 about Pius XII. That's something I'm working on right now. I said, you don't know how to use the media. 2 months later, I could have given him the same address about the sex abuse crisis, how they didn't know how to use the media. I could do the same thing now because they're afraid, and they're divided. They're as divided as Congress is, and there's no dialogue. And that's several years ago, Matt Boggs was interviewing the author of a new biography of Jerry Ford. And the author was saying that Jerry Ford was not Nixon's first choice. And Matt interrupted him and said, but Jerry Ford was well respected within Congress, as he was a frequent visitor to my family's home. His father was the House Majority Leader, Hale Boggs, the husband of Lindy Boggs. And what he was pointing out, and this was almost 10 years ago, there's no dialogue anymore. There's no crossing over the aisle, and that's true in the church. So that's the problem with even the bishops not speaking out. They don't know how to use the medium. There's no interest whatsoever in dialogue. One of the bishops told me it used to be at the annual bishops' meeting, they would have the lunch break, and they would just go out to lunch with the guy next to them. No, they don't. It's all ideological within politics, within the church. And it's very hard to get across anything. I get attacked every Sunday, by the way. If I get attacked on a homily, I simultaneously get attacked by left and right. So that means I stand in a position of the extreme center.
Let's give this great panel a hand of applause. Outside this door are lunches available for everyone. Take them back to your tables and eat them here. We'll reconvene at 1:15 for the address by Mr. John Sweeney.
thank you. Oh, really? Your son? Okay, what is your name again? Oh, really?
I just got a Fulbright fellowship to go to Ireland. Yeah, I'm going to be in Dublin. Yeah, I got a year to do some research and teach at Dublin City University. Yeah. No. It was a good question. Yeah. Right.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. Well, I just spent Easter with a...
No, it's a relevant question. I don't know how to answer it exactly.
Back
I wouldn't know how to answer it exactly. It was a scholarly answer. A little bit what I gave you.
What upsets me?
Yes and no. And there's
40% of our undergraduates are Catholic. When I